I will start with a small update to the year when the last research was published. It's a little bit more fresh than 2009. It's 2019, in fact. Which, hopefully, right, there's better news to report in 2019 than in 2009. After all, it's 10 years of a gap that we're talking about. So thank you again for giving me this opportunity, and I'm very honored to be speaking and sharing the results of this research with all of you, particularly given that you just announced the Women in Dairy Network efforts to drive more diversity, particularly gender diversity in the industry. I applaud your efforts and look forward to helping you and inspiring you and giving you some data-backed insights to help you in your efforts. So let me first start by explaining a little bit what Women in the Workplace research is about. Some of you may have heard about it. For some, it might be new, so I'll start with a little bit overview. At McKinsey, we like data. And we were very hungry several years ago to understand where do we stand as the firm for our own diversity efforts relative to our peers, relative to other companies in corporate America in driving diversity amongst our own ranks. And then we were also getting questions from a number of companies we work with on whether what they were doing was enough and how they could accelerate and drive bigger diversity numbers in their organizations. And we discovered there wasn't enough of the data readily available, so we partnered with leanin.org, led by Sheryl Sandberg, to do a small pilot. And about 30 or so companies decided to participate and voluntarily gave us data about how their diversity pipeline of talent across all levels in the organization looked like at that point of time. And together we developed a methodology to standardize the way that the data is reported across companies, and also found out what kind of drivers, what kind of data points to look at in order to make any conclusions about where we stand and what helps or doesn't help companies to make progress. So that was started more than 5 years ago, and we are incredibly humbled and also honored that since that initial pilot beginning, we've been able to continue the partnership for 5 years straight now. And we've released the report in every year since 2015, and we'll continue to do so. From both sides, there's strong intent to continue to provide data to organizations about where we stand as corporate North America in terms of diversity. And since 2015, close to 600 companies participated. Those companies cover a range of industries and also company sizes. And we do have a number of dairy companies participating already, but we hope to grow that number so that you guys have more robust benchmark as an industry for diversity. And then we also started to expand the scope of what we cover when we engage with companies. So we not only ask companies to share their pipeline data and all of the inflows and outflows in terms of diverse talent, but also are looking at policies and programs in place today for what kind of efforts companies have to advance diversity and inclusion, as well as do a direct survey to employees, often just a pilot or a sample within the organizations to get direct inputs on how they feel day to day, which efforts really work, which efforts don't. And that addition over time became one of the biggest sources of insight about what really helps companies advance, or on the contrary, what are the challenges to continue to solve. So over time, over the last 5 years, this has amounted to 250,000 of responses directly from employees, and that makes this kind of research the largest of its kind. So that's definitely a very humbling set of numbers for us at McKinsey to look at, but we're really, really excited every year to share the results and also to report on progress that is being made across the companies that participate. So that was the research. Before I go into the real findings and the numbers, I wanted to go back to the question of the business case for diversity. And when I first joined the research team, I felt a little bit, okay, why do we even need to talk about the business case? for doing something as intuitive as I felt at that point in time. But it turns out that it does help organizations to affirm their commitment, to make sure that everyone is on the same page for why it is important to focus on diversity and inclusion. And I wanted to just highlight two pieces of research related to this topic. One of them is our own. It's research that is done by my colleagues based in Europe. They look at over 800 companies globally, and they repeat it regularly. They look at which companies economically outperform their peers. It turns out that if a company has a racially diverse leadership team, it is 33% more likely to outperform its peers that have less racial diversity. For gender diversity, the number is a little bit lower, but it's still a very strong positive correlation. Those companies that have strong gender diversity in the leadership teams are 24% more likely to outperform their peers. So this is a huge data set of companies. There's also quite a bit of careful controls being done for making sure that the companies are compared in the same industry space and in the same geography. And those results have been tested year in, year out, and that's the latest set of numbers. So it's a good reminder that there's a good economic reason, right? The board of directors, the shareholders of your companies should be looking for that kind of reason to drive more diversity and inclusion. But then there's another reason, which is more related to talent. And this came out in our last year's research and then responses to the survey questions sent directly to employees at the companies that participated. And it turns out that younger employees are more likely to be very engaged on this topic. Again, it might be very intuitive inside, but it was important for us to see how strongly it comes through in the data. And how clearly it says, look, this is going to be an important topic for the younger part of your workforce already and going forward, as you can see. So we define younger employees as those that are under 30 years old, and then we compare them to those employees that are over 45 years old. And there's a pretty strong difference on the first question, right? The younger employees are much more likely to raise the need for doing more on diversity and inclusion topics. But then also the second question was, we asked folks that participated in the survey, do you see bias in the workplace in the organization you're part of? And the younger employees were much more likely to say yes, both men and women. So that's on the business case for diversity, just a refresher, and I'm sure you can find lots more studies that talk about this. But practically speaking, we see companies that have actual active conversation internally with some regularity about why they believe diversity is important for them, right? That could be your workforce, that could be your shareholders believing that diversity leads to better outcomes. That could be your customers, right? I'm a big buyer of milk for my children. So that's an important start of a conversation and a stronger commitment, and also better results for companies is to be very clear on why you're going and talking about diversity and then investing some of your time and some of your resources into that. Okay, so numbers. As I said, we started this because we were hungry for data, and there will be quite a bit of data, but I'll take it slow and I'll walk you through the numbers that I'm going to show you. And then what I wanted to ask you first, before I share the data, is to raise your hand if you know what the diversity numbers are by each level of your organization. This is about what I would expect in terms of the share of hands that were raised up. We see through companies that participate in this research that companies are frequently looking at just one number, which is what is the total share of women in the total workforce. What do you do about that number? How do you even compare it to anyone else? And so you stand at 40%. What does it mean? What do you do about this? So we are strong believers to encourage companies a lot to go and get much more granular data. If you start breaking that number by level, right? How many women do you have at the entry level versus men? How many do you have at the next level up? And so on. Then you start breaking this down by which part of the organization you are looking at. I serve several high technology companies, and they have a huge problem with diversity. And one thing that I always ask them is, don't give me the overall number, but tell me, how many women do you have at manager level in your R&D organizations? It turns out that that's exactly where the problem is. That's where they lose the most of the most valuable talent that they have. So for your organizations, in your industry, I encourage you to look at what is the breakdown, not only by level, but also by different parts of your organization. What is it in distribution? What is it in marketing? What is it in finance, etc.? That's where you start getting real insights as to what is happening. So this is the picture of basically average numbers across all of the companies that participated in 2019. And it's a lot of numbers, as I warned you, so let me walk you through this. For every level, and you see 6 levels represented here, from entry level through manager, senior manager, and so on, we show you what was the share that women represented as percentage of the total employees at that level. So we start at 48%, which is very close to the average, basically, composition of the workforce at the entry level. This is also roughly the composition of the college graduates, right? That's the entry workforce. But then, across all of the companies, when you average the numbers, we see that that representation, that number, declines at every level, right? From entry level all the way up to C-suite. We start with roughly parity, 1-to-1 share of men to women, and we go down to 1 out of 5 in C-suite being a woman. And that number is actually even worse, and that trajectory is even worse for women of color. I didn't want to put a lot of numbers on the slide, it would be too complicated, but if you can imagine that at the entry level, 1 out of every 6 entry-level employees is a woman of color, it's about 17%. And it goes down to only 1 out of 25 at the C-suite level. It's a really stark picture of starting roughly at the level of the workforce representation in general, right? You recruit roughly the fair share of talent of all colors and all genders, but then by the time you look at the C-suite, the picture is very skewed, and it's, again, 1 out of 5 is a woman, and 1 out of 25 is a woman of color. So then the very natural question is, what happens, right? So how do you go and how do you, what drives the decline in that representation from level to level? And over the years, we started to see a very clear picture that if you look at the inflows and outflows, right? So to become a manager, you need to be promoted, or you need to be hired from the outside directly at that level. So the number one reason for the huge decline from the entry level to manager level in women representation is that women are less likely to be promoted than men. And it's a pretty stark set of numbers. It's something like for every 100 men promoted, there's only roughly 70 or less women that are promoted. You start at parity, but then you promote a lot more men than women, and then you get to this picture. Other factors such as attrition or external hiring do not contribute that much. It's a lot of this is the rate of promotion for men versus women. And then that picture is not as stark at future promotion levels, but it still stays, right? There's still decline in representation level to level. And then the last comment I'll make on this slide before we move to the food industry data is that we were really keen to see how much progress we're making year over year since we started this research. And we were a little bit disappointed in the first year and then again in the second year because the numbers don't move that much year over year. But looking back at 5 years of data, we see some good news. There was a lot of progress made at the very top of companies. There's a lot more women in SVP roles and C-suite in general in North America. It's a huge progress made compared to all of the negative news about, taking 100 years or more to get to parity. But it's positive progress, and there are definitely some things at work that are contributing to that. But then the progress has been a lot smaller at all of the other levels. And so that's the really big area we focused on in our research this year, is what's happening at the lower levels. And if companies are making more progress than others, then what do they do? So I'll talk to that a little bit later. How to basically start fixing the earlier part of the talent pipeline. Now, I did say that we have a few companies that represent their industry in our research. There wasn't enough to pull the full pipeline picture just for that subset, so we extended it to food and beverage manufacturers. So these are the numbers. And the really remarkable thing is that the numbers match exactly the North America averages for the first 4 levels in the pipeline, and then they diverge for the top 2 levels of the pipeline. So as an industry, you are exactly where corporate North America is on average. You're just hitting the mark exactly right, up until you get to the SVP level. So then the food and beverage industry has 22% representation for women versus 26% for all companies in North America. And then it gets a little bit worse again at the next level at the C-suite, where it's 16% in food and beverage industry versus 21% for North America overall. So that number, when I said 1 in 5 out of senior leaders are women, it's about 1 out of 6 for the food and beverage industry. So then that's on the numbers. It's not just the numbers, right? It's not just how many people you have. It's not about being invited to the party, it's also being allowed to dance at the party that matters. So that's why it's important to also look at the culture and how inclusive the organizations are. It's important to look at the day-to-day experiences of all employees, men and women, people of color, all of the other minority attributes. And we figured out over time that there are at least 3 important attributes of culture to focus on practically for speaking with many companies that are making quite steady progress on diversity, looking at the data from our research over years. Those 3 big attributes of culture are equal opportunity and fairness. So does for example, opportunities that are great for career promotion, that are great for personal growth, go to the most deserving employees, right? That goes back to the concept of meritocracy. The second attribute is whether we have a safe and respectful workplace, and I'll speak to both of those later. And then the last attribute is, of course, work and life diversity. So that topic probably gets a lot more coverage than the first 2. Now, before I go into the data again, I'll ask you guys to raise your hands one more time. When you see gender-biased behavior in your organization, do you challenge it? Okay, should be better than this. Should be better than this, but also not surprising given what we see also in our research. So one big problem with this statement and asking this question is that you first have to recognize biased behavior. And if you don't recognize it, well, we shouldn't expect you to challenge it, right? So we did quite a bit of focus in our research report 2 years ago that quite a lot of men and women alike in their organizations do not believe that they should be making more progress on diversity. With something like close to half of all men in our report from 2017 were telling us that they have enough women in their organization's leadership teams when that share of women was just 1 in 10. Right? So they were in organizations that were way behind many others, and yet they felt that they were doing fine. And then a huge share of women in those organizations believed exactly the same thing. Now, it could be that our bars are set very low, right? It could be that, you look around yourself, you see many other organizations that are not doing great. You look at media and culture, and a lot of companies are portrayed as led primarily by men, and then you say, yeah, we have at least 1 woman, so we're good. And obviously, it's not quite where we should be. But then this year, what we did is we also asked a number of questions about what do people actually perceive and also see in the workplace. And this was one of the most striking findings for our team, is that when we ask people, do you notice biased behaviors day to day in the workplace? And only 1 in 10 men that responded to the survey said that they do. Right? It's hard to expect them to take action if they don't recognize. A big portion of them, day to day, don't see that there's any biased behavior that is happening. And I'm going to speak a little bit more to bias, but it's not a negative thing, right? Bias is, in and of itself, it's a coping mechanism, right? Our brains are wired to find shortcuts. Now, unfortunately, some of those shortcuts are not helping few other colleagues included, and that's why it's important to recognize biases. And it's important also to help others recognize those biases. So one big conclusion we got out of this is that, hey, as much as people don't like unconscious bias trainings, those trainings are important. And also it's important to find ways to make them more effective. Right? Practically 2/3 of organizations in our research have some kind of unconscious bias training in place today. But then also we hear from a lot of people that, hey, we've got to find better ways to talk about bias and to recognize bias and to remind people about it that will be more effective. But it's important. So then we also asked questions in this year's survey about how the employees perceive whether the opportunities for growth are equally available to them. And you see here some of the numbers. It's not the full set of questions we asked on this topic, but this is some of the most interesting numbers. For the first question on equal opportunity for growth, about 69% of men said that they believe that they have just as much opportunity as other employees and their peers. But then when you look at different cohorts of women, white women feel exactly the same, which is great. Asian women are a little bit behind, and so are Latinas. But then black women, it's a pretty big difference. They do not feel as strongly that they get the same opportunity as other employees at their level. And one thing that I always look at is, okay, what's the absolute level of that response rate, and whether it feels like that's where we should be, right? 56%, that's just about over 1/2 of all black women. Right? So then the other half of black women believe that they do not get equal opportunity as their peers, and that's not a great statistic. It's a pretty sombering statistic, to be honest. And then the bottom set of numbers on the chart shows an even bigger contrast. So we were asking the question of whether they believed that opportunities went to the most deserving employees. And so half of men felt that that's the case, and the other half obviously didn't feel that way. Right? So it's a question of meritocracy. But then as you look at the number of responses for women, you see white women and Asian women do not agree with that as much. And then again, black women, just over 1/4 of black women believe that opportunities go to the most deserving employees. So that's, again, yet another really striking statistic that we do not have, at least in companies that participated in this survey, the culture where there's fairness and opportunity, which is important for employees to feel that they're included, to feel that they have the same chances of getting ahead, right? And that they can be one day a manager or senior manager in an organization. So then a similar looking graph, but slightly different set of questions. We also started studying microaggressions in the workplace. And why this is important is because this is like an extra mental load that minorities and women have of seeing small, like unintentional things happen day to day and then deciding, what do you do about this? So I remember starting in consulting 10 years ago, feeling particularly challenged in team rooms where some of my most outspoken colleagues were constantly interrupting me. I did have to address some problems of my own, but my initial reaction was to just shut down and sit back and not participate. And that's something that is an important dynamic in the workplace. When those small microaggressions, they're not intentional. My colleagues were not trying to shut me down. They just had a different communication style. And I was a more naturally quiet and shy person that preferred to listen. But if you think about this on a bigger scale, it does impact women and minorities quite a bit. And what we hear, even more disturbingly, than just pure interruptions, is that there are also more cases that women experience than men of being challenged and being, expertise being questioned, right? Who are you to be proposing this idea? What kind of research have you done? What kind of experience do you have? Or in my case, 10 years ago, oh, you look too young to be consulting me. So there's a lot of microaggressions and they add up day to day, and it's an extra load. And one particularly striking quote we heard last year was from a young Black woman who said, I actually feel like day to day I have to represent the entire race, and it's exhausting. I can imagine, right, feeling that way day to day, right? And this is a really, really heavy field, really heavy field. So those microaggressions, they can have a macro impact on individual employees, but then the whole cohorts of those employees in organizations, and we see that through data. So the conclusion here is it's important as you work on diversity and inclusion programs in your organizations to also consider what are you doing to help change the climate in the small teams, right, that work together day to day so that fewer of those happen. Or people learn to recognize when that happens and pull each other on that. So that the minority groups that get more of those microaggressions day to day are less impacted by them. Okay, so then moving to action, moving to what practically is being done and what kind of things seem to be driving better results. So I promise this is the last poll question I'm going to do. Could you raise your hand if your organization is committed to diversity? Okay, finally, we're getting a lot of hands raised. Maybe the previous ones were not raised just because you guys needed a break. So this is really what we see in data as well, that over 90% of organizations say that diversity and inclusion is one of the top topics for their senior management teams. And that number, by the way, has been growing year over year quite a bit. So since when we first started, it was 60-something%. It is now well over 90%. It's well recognized as a top topic, as a top priority topic for top management teams. Then here's what happens, unfortunately. From the top team setting that as a priority topic to actual action that happens day to day, there are a few things that need to basically be correlated. But then when we asked employees in the survey if they're personally committed to gender diversity, we saw, first of all, a difference between what senior managers say versus less senior managers say, right? So there's one big drop that happens between senior leaders and managers, right? The top priority for the organization doesn't translate into the top priority for for medium level managers. Then there's another translation gap, another drop that happens where you go from talking the talk to walking the walk. When you ask folks if they're actually working day to day, actively, to improve diversity in their organizations, the number, like the share of all of the folks that responded and said yes is much lower, right? It's less than half of all employees at 46%. We would want this to be higher. If this is a top priority, right, in 90 organizations, this is a top priority for senior management, but then those same senior leaders are saying, do I actively do something on that today? No, not really. And that's a bit of a problem. And that should be a little bit a more shared load. And then the final translation gap, which is the biggest, the middle level managers that say they're actively doing something day to day to improve diversity in their organization, that number is just 16%. And that's a huge population. That's a huge share of all the managers that have day-to-day interactions with their teams, right? This is the real pain point, the real breakage point, if you will, from translating the top-level agenda item into actual execution. Right? This is basically an analogy to this would be saying, as an organization, we would like to grow our revenues by 10% this year, and then allowing middle-level managers to not even see that as their top priority, or not do anything about this. Like, how do you think this organization will grow? If you want to really make progress, then maybe it's a good idea to start using the same techniques for managing progress to that objective, in the same way as you would for managing your top line growth or managing your bottom line. Okay, so that is on that point. Not another set of numbers, but also a little bit on the positive side, tactical things that we see companies that make progress do. So when I was talking about the really big drop-off from the entry-level representation number to the manager level number, right? Remember I called out that promotions were the biggest driver. So we call this the broken rung, right? So imagine a ladder. There's bottom few steps on the ladder, and for women, those bottom rungs of the ladder are kind of not there. Pretty hard to climb when they're not there. So how do you fix that? We identified at least 5 actions, right? Similar to my analogy to managing revenue growth objective or managing profitability objective. You would start by setting a goal, right? I want to increase my women's representation by X%, or I want to be at that level by year 2025. Then the second really tactical set of actions also lies in making sure that you have diverse slates of candidates as you bring your talent from outside in. One really common challenge we see with organizations that set targets and don't achieve them is that they are not setting the same kind of targets on the inflow of talent, right? It's kind of hard to just set the number on where you end up if you don't also focus on what comes in and what goes out. Or allowing the recruiting managers to move fast, right? Say, there's not enough qualified women candidates. I don't have time, my business is not waiting, therefore I have 2 great guys and I'm going to interview them. There's no women hires that will come out of that process. And that's basically the recommendation number 2. And then the share of companies that actually have a rule related to this in place is incredibly low, it's just 11%. Just 11%. Number 3 is to put evaluators, the folks that are making decisions both in the hiring process, but also in the performance review process and the promotions process internally through unconscious bias training. And this has been a pretty hot topic over the last 2 years. We hear from a lot of organizations that there's fatigue. There's a little bit of like, okay, why do I have to take this unconscious bias training again? Right? Why is this something that I do to check the box once a year? And the reality is that that kind of training is not as effective. Right? If people just go through that without engaging to check the box, it doesn't stick that much. But the training that does seem to have more impact is when it's offered to specifically evaluators. And it happens at the times when they're just about to start either the hiring process or hiring decision-making process or the internal performance reviews and promotions. That's when it really starts to click. And then when you say, you're about to go into the performance evaluations. Here's a short reminder, because you already know the basics. Here's a short reminder of the specific biases that usually come up in that particular process. And here's the keywords to look for. Here's the kinds of things to pay attention to. That kind of training tends to be a lot more effective. Number 4 is to set clear evaluation criteria. And that one is pretty self-explanatory, and actually, this is the one that most companies have been working on over the last 5 years, at least as we've been engaging with them. And also a lot higher share of companies have in place. And then the final one is to also basically build the pipeline of talent internally identify your high potential men and women, all relevant, qualified employees, and put effort into making sure they are aware of potential opportunities and they're considered for those promotion or opportunities, or just simply big projects, big opportunities that usually lead to growth. So very practical set of steps. None of them is a big blinding insight. Actually, the first year when we tried to formulate what are the things that the companies are doing well, we were a little bit worried about the outcome. The steps and the actions that companies were taking all seemed pretty basic. There was nothing that was a silver bullet. But the real traction happens when companies really focus on outcomes and are actually focused on how well those basic steps work day in and day out in different parts of the organization. So it comes back to discipline. It becomes less about what you do, but how well do you execute it. Okay, so then one last thing that I'll share with you is that in addition to those 5 steps focused on fixing the broken run, the early steps in the talent pipeline, we also highlighted 3 sets of actions that companies seem to take. And we've been evolving this set of actions year over year, and it's a huge debate for us internally on what kind of actions to highlight. But there seems to be a group of 3 that are pretty consistent. And that is, first of all, to take bias out of hiring and promotion processes. And that goes back to several steps that I just shared with you. The second one is building a culture of fairness and opportunity. And that is about having a really honest dialogue internally about who are the people that you want to promote, who are the high potential men and women and people of color at the level -1, level -2 in the organization that you want to invest in and you want to grow. A lot of this also deals with putting in place sponsorship and mentoring programs. So one specific thing that we do, and we recommend to it every year at McKinsey, is requiring all of our senior partners and also partners to declare at the beginning of the year which specific few associates or engagement managers we would each take on during the year and help find opportunities and help get through difficult times. So that's our internal effort that seems to be working. Not in 100% of the cases, but that's an example of a sponsorship program in place. And lastly, inclusive workplaces. This is a lot about creating awareness about what it feels like to be, for example, a woman of color in the room, or what it is like. I told you my personal story about being a shy and quiet person who just entered the organization and wasn't quite sure when I have the right to speak and have an opinion. And creating more awareness at the lower level management so that those folks start basically telling us more often at higher than 16% rate that they're actively doing something to promote diversity and inclusion day to day. So that's the end of my lecturing, and I wanted to mention that there's a lot more detail in our annual report, and the last report from 2019, as well as all of the previous ones, are available at womenintheworkplace.com. It's distributed free of charge, and this is something that we hope you leverage, and it helps you guide your own diversity and inclusion efforts. And then lastly, for companies that participate in this research, it's free. We do this as a pro bono research effort. So if you want your organization to participate, we're going to start basically registering companies for participation and engaging them for 2020 in February. So this is perfect timing if you want to join and if you want to benefit from benchmarking against other companies. And I do hope that we have more companies in the dairy industry, so you also get the benefit of strong benchmarks against your own peers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arina, for all of those insights. We're going to sit down and take some questions from you, and I have a few to start off, but my colleague Tracy has a microphone that she will pass around, so just raise your hand, but it was really interesting information, and I think particularly some of the practical steps you talked about of the different things you could do. And one of them that was the most prevalent had to do with establish clear evidence-based criteria to prevent bias. Could you give a little bit more examples of what types of criteria that you've experienced that companies have put in place?
Yeah, it's a great question. This is like, this practical tactical is where it really, you either lose it or you are starting to make traction. I'll give you one example from a high-tech company where I engaged a lot with their HR and diversity inclusion team on their progress, particularly with technical talent. So we looked at the data for the technical sales team. So for them, the most critical talent in the organization is either R&D employees, those that are developing new products, or the technical sales folks that can help explain to customers exactly how to deploy those products or how to make them work in really, really specific environments. And they realized in looking at the criteria for their technical sales team that they, as they were hiring new employees, they looked at the very small talent pool and they kept complaining that there's not enough of the good talent to bring in general, like men and women, any color. But then they also said, well, and that is also why we don't have the luxury to be looking for women, because we just have to hire whoever we find, and most of those people were men. And as we unpacked the exact technical criteria for hiring that were in the job description, it basically said, you have to have experience with our products in an IT organization somewhere else for at least 10 years. And that limited the available pool dramatically. And so we had a number of debates about what really were the characteristics of employees that tended to do really well in their technical sales team versus those that they felt comfortable hiring. And it turns out that you need to look not only at the technical qualifications, and this was purely technical qualification. You don't even need to be a good salesperson, right? You don't need to connect with people well if you were just able to maintain a technical environment for 10 years. But the characteristics that they were able to rewrite their job descriptions for were all focused on, can you build a great rapport with another person? Can you understand the nuances of their organization? And it turns out that after doing a lot of this discovery on what were the attributes of great technical salespeople, they found that those intrinsic qualities were much more important than the technical qualifications. And as they started to recruit with the new job criteria, they started to get a lot more applications from women. And it started with a very kind of business problem that had nothing, well, it was basically an excuse for not hiring women, but it turned out that it solved not only for more diversity, but also solved for a much better pool of applicants, period. So it's a good thing to examine those criteria, not just for diversity.
Excellent. We'd love to take your questions for Arina.
If there's a
great comment. Thank you.
You were talking about doing the same study in Europe. Were there any big ahas from there that you say, what are the big differences? Was there any one country which stood out, or saying, okay, this is how it's very different there, or not very different, what's good and what's bad?
Yeah, I'm smiling at your question because we actually don't do exactly this study in Europe. We do get asked, particularly global companies that participate in our research ask for that all the time. And it's a really big decision, big resource commitment for us to make. What I would suspect, though, from other research related to diversity that we do there, is that companies that have been, they're basically cultural, historical drivers, right, of very different levels where other countries are relative to the US. So I have Russian background. There are some nuances in the Russian culture where I think those will weigh very heavily on anyone who tries to get a more diverse and inclusive team in that country in particular. I was recently speaking with a company that has big presence in Germany. They're really important stereotypes in place for what working mothers are supposed or not supposed to do, and all of that is important, of course. One last example I'll bring is there are laws in some countries that require a certain number of women to be on boards of directors, and then they also help get more women into senior leadership teams. California just started, right, to actually put in practice that new law this year. Like this year is the first year when companies at certain size are required to have at least one woman director on the board, and that's going to grow to 2 women on the board. So all of those factors are really important. And that's why doing research just in North America is a lot easier than doing research in Europe. That is a bit of a patchwork of those many, many different unique situations.
Hi, maybe a comment or what you said around, do you challenge gender bias behavior when you see it? First, you have to recognize it. I'm interested to hear what recommendations you have for getting people to recognize it that might not.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that we are just starting to see examples and good practices emerge for that. I think there's more of the best practices that are going to form over time. But I'll give you 2 examples that for me were really kind of striking, but also seem to have led to really strong results for companies that share them. One is an industrial equipment manufacturer, and unfortunately I can't name names, but it's a pretty big brand company that set a target several years ago and realized that they need to address exactly that problem. And the solution that they deployed is they basically hired a video crew that worked together with HR and diversity and inclusion team and went and asked volunteers from all parts of the organization to talk about what does it feel to them like to feel included or not included, and what specific experiences make them feel or do not feel included. So it became a lot about sharing very personal anecdotes, and they recorded a whole bunch of those small video videos, and then they compiled a video for the executive team and for the board of directors to look into, and to basically required homework, right, to view the video and then come and talk about what they want to do after watching that video. And they called it an empathy building exercise. And it was eye-opening when we spoke with that leadership team after they have watched that video. They said that they didn't appreciate enough what some of those day-to-day experiences meant, and so how much more needs to be done so that people in their factories and their design teams and their commercial teams wouldn't be feeling that. It was very, very impactful. I heard of another very big consumer products company do a similar exercise. So they're not doing the same kind of videos, but they're collecting stories, and they're sharing them not just with the executive team, but they're sharing that through the whole organization. And then they added a curriculum to talk about this and to encourage people to share with others how they feel and what others could be doing to make them feel more included. The last example is Starbucks. I'm sure you remember more than a year ago, Starbucks went through a pretty critical experience where they realized that they need to introduce a whole different level of learning across the organization. They made a big investment into both creating that training and then also closing the stores and for a whole day across the country to make sure that their employees are able to take that training. And then they published it online. It's a really, really interesting course, and I would encourage you to look into that if you haven't already.
Thank you. It was a really interesting presentation. I was wondering if you could say more about the role of encouraging male majority race leaders to also be involved as sponsors, and thank you to all the men who are in the room, by the way. In my experience, it's often helpful when people understand that the need for diversity is not just for diverse people involved. So A, do you think that that is important? And B, do you have any advice for those in the room, many of whom may be in majority-dominated leadership structures, and how to encourage leaders who may not feel that personal need to get involved?
I'll first say that yes, it is very important, right, for men and women to participate in diversity and inclusion efforts. And one example that our own leader of diversity and inclusion shares is that when we introduced longer paternity and maternity leaves for our consultants, she heard a lot more from men than from women on the changes in policy. And she said, I was a line of people out my door, and they were all men, and they were telling me how much they appreciated the change. And so for her, that was a big light bulb moment that, okay, she is a diversity and inclusion officer, but that is for everyone. And so we now call it all in, instead of diversity and inclusion, we call it all in, right? It's for all of us. I think that's one thing to realize, is that it's important and it also benefits all employees if leaders are promoting diversity and promoting inclusion. And then the second thing that I would say is that just like I was sharing with you in the data, sometimes people are just not aware of what they could be doing. On the contrary, they might be scared of doing something that may be misinterpreted. And so finding ways to give managers tools and micro habits day to day might be the way to go to increase that level of comfort and level of awareness. And I'll just lastly share one small example that I heard at the beginning of the year, at the beginning of the month, sorry, it's still the same month. A company, also the same high-tech company with a strong presence in Germany, was looking into how to make it easier for managers to make more inclusive decisions day to day. So what they were piloting was to basically have the compensation, basically adjustment system, to calculate the same merit increases for men and women in each of the teams for every people manager. And then the managers have to adjust it and justify the adjustment. Instead of the managers inputting some kind of numbers into the system and then someone doing any sort of checks afterwards if men and women get different merit increases. So just finding those ways to make it easier for managers day to day to be inclusive and to remember that they have diverse teams and everyone benefits from it.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience. Get all sides in a row. Great, thank you.
Thank you. So as a female member of our C-suite team, and I have 4 male colleagues, and I'm the female executive of the company, and I head of HR, Chief People Officer by title. I am very sensitive to diversity in the workplace. We are a dairy processor. We have about 1,000 employees in California. I say the country of California because it truly is a different country. One of the things that I have found challenging is we have equitable total comp. Total rewards platform, it doesn't matter what your gender is, what your ethnicity is. We have standardized reporting, so we do know, who we have in all categories within each level of our organization because it's required by law. One of the things that I have found challenging, though, is the amount of women, because we are a very physically demanding company. They are physically laborious positions, okay? And just naturally, you have the tendency for more men to apply for warehousing jobs, wherein the job safety requirements are going to require you to physically be able to do certain things. How do you combat that, right? Because we don't have a lot of clerical. I mean, out of 400 truck drivers that we've had, I've had 1 female truck driver that has applied. So what efforts are other people doing in the industry to help kind of open up that talent pool? Whatever that might be, because you just have limitations in females that are represented in different jobs.
Yeah. That's a wonderful question, and I wish I knew more about your industry or had an easy answer. I hear this from other companies and other industries too. It's the core of the question applies in many other industries for many other different positions, and it's important to be aware, right, of what your available talent pool is. And if you're big enough, then you can try to impact that available talent pool. So I've done quite a bit of work with high-tech companies, and I work in the technology space, and the talent pool, women do not like to go to computer science programs. So companies are starting to do a lot more than before to encourage that, and there's a whole set of efforts that the industry is spearheading there. But there's no easy answer, unfortunately. And some of it is about finding ways to attract people either through the rest of your organization, right? Make them aware of opportunities that might be more attractive than what they're doing. Some of it may be working together with other companies in your space to see what you can do as an industry. I'm afraid that that's the best answer I can give to you. It's a hard problem to solve for sure.
There's like restructuring via automation to where, maybe there's a female candidate that can in fact, drag 100 pounds belt down line. There's some limitations.
I definitely appreciate it.
It's not just women though, because you face the same challenge with aging workforce.
And disabilities.
It really gets to how do you target your automation, how do you look at job SOPs to identify those, because a lot of times those tasks aren't what they do all day long. So how do you structure your teams so that those physical parts of the job can be done in pairs and take some of those safety risks out? Because again, I'm whether we run 33 manufacturing plants, we have that challenge every day. And we try to make sure we don't design any job that has physical requirements that precludes a woman from taking that job. And the more that we structure our team structure where we don't have one job, one task, one person, it's more of a team dynamic, then you can start to look at those tasks that require two people and build your team structure so that you don't put anybody at risk. But it's safe for aging workforces because you get a strong man or woman that signs up for a company's job, and they may be able to do the job when they're in their 20s and 30s, but when they're in their 50s and early 60s, their body wears out. So you've got to constantly look at that.
Can I just offer something to all of you two? This exchange that you just had, you have a problem, and she saw exactly the same problem in the organization. This exchange is very important at the industry level, and we see many examples of industry organizations forming or refining their mandates and charters and programs to start focusing on engaging their members in the specific industry around sharing solutions to common problems, and then also pooling some of the efforts so that they can change the outcomes, right? So that you can attract more women, or so that you can together maybe develop more automation, to your point, that can make some of the tasks easier. And we started to work with some of those industry associations 3 years ago. And we started, actually, not surprisingly, in the food services industry. So Women's Food Services Forum, you might be familiar with them. They started focusing first on restaurants, now they moved into food manufacturing and distribution. And they convene forums just focused on diversity challenges annually, and the last I remember, their last forum drew more than 3,000 participants. Right? So imagine the kind of idea sharing and joint solution creation that can happen when you pool your resources together and when you exchange that information. And then since then, we've encountered organizations from healthcare, from high tech, from media, newsrooms organizations reached out to us, and institutional asset managers. There's a huge, vast list of organizations that we've now encountered that are all starting to basically saying either we are formed with primary focus on gender diversity, or we are formed to tackle a broad set of issues in the industry, and this is one of them that we want to emphasize and start solving. But this kind of collaboration within the industry, the specifics of what happens and the challenges you have is very, very important.
That is a perfect close to our session, because that's what we hope to do with the Women in Dairy Network. And we're so glad to be launching it, to have you share this research, to start the exchange. And we hope that more women continue to spread the word through your organizations so they will also join. It's open to every woman that's interested in the dairy industry, not just IDFA members. We want students, we want academics, we want leaders, we want up-and-comers. So we're so happy to be launching this effort. My colleague, Tracy Boyle, will be heading up the Women in Dairy Network. And Tracy, if you don't know her, is IDFA's Director of Employee Relations and Administrative Services, who's been working with us for many, many years at IDFA. So I'm sure you'll have a chance to meet her. There's lots of information on our website about women in dairy. But Irina, thank you so much for bringing McKinsey's insights, and we look forward to working more with you. Please join me in thanking you.